Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Hear the word of the Lord.
In the bush, a dingo is about to give birth to a litter of pups. She finds a quite dried billabong near a strong flowing river, thinking it would be safe. It's her time to give birth. Just then, dark clouds gather and lightning strikes, starting a bushfire on the far side of the billabong. She looks down the river and sees a hunter with his spear ready to throw at her. She moves upriver and sees a crocodile approaching her. What does the dingo do? She is giving birth. She cannot run. She cannot swim. Will she survive? Will she give birth to pups? Will they survive? Will everything be burnt by the fire? Will she be killed by the hunter? Will she be eaten by the ravenous crocodile? She is trapped by the bushfire on one side and the flowing river on the other. She's blocked in by her predators on all other sides. What does she do? The dingo's priorities are about to be shown. What she does next will reveal what is most important. Priorities are always on show, not just for desperate scenarios, but everyday life also. They're what people manipulate to raise money. Take this quote. Don't tell me what your priorities are. Show me where you spend your money and I'll tell you what they are. Priorities are what people use to decide what is good and bad for them to do. Actions expresses priority. Priorities also put things into real life perspective. When we put God first, all other things fall into their proper place or drop out of our lives. Our love of the Lord will govern the claims for our affection, the demands on our time, the interests we pursue, and the order of our priorities. We are more creative, more passionate, more energetic, more accepting of sacrifice to the things we prioritise, and others will see this. Our priorities are shown. If we read 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10, we see Christians are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. As Christians, our very existence is designed to prioritise the praise of the one who called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. The transformation of Christians' priorities is the proof that they really do belong to God. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Why do priorities change when you become a Christian? 1 Peter 2:11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. We no longer belong to the world. Here we live as foreigners and exiles. If we do not think in those terms, but are frankly comfortable with the world and its ways, we ought to question whether or not we really are God's special possession. This is why Peter writes in 1 Peter 2:12, live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. People around us have different priorities to us as followers of Jesus. The pagan, that's Peter's word for those that do not follow Jesus, does not see something. Call it the bushfire or the river or the hunter or the hungry croc. The pagan, the non-follower of Jesus, does not see the danger. Their priorities will be different to ours because we see that there will be a day that God visits us. A day that God enters our life in a way that will be irreversible and final. God will visit us because we are already eternal. Peter calls this as us having a soul. Living apart from this eternal reality is what Peter calls following our sinful desires. God visiting us because of sin is separation from God and judgment. God visiting us because of our following Jesus is reconciliation to God and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you. One day, the eternal nature of our existence and our relation to God will be made obvious to all. Right now, our world is ignorant to God and the fact that we are tied to him eternally. Right now, we as Christians are called foreigners and exiles. In the very place we live and love and eat and work, in the very place we should be able to call home, we do not belong. We abstain from sinful desires which wage war against our soul. You see, we are more creative, more passionate, more energetic, more accepting of sacrifice to the things we prioritise. We do not belong here. Our priorities will show this. To those that don't know God, they will see our priorities and they may see your good deeds and glorify God. But the goal of human priorities is the glory of God. So If you're hemmed in on all sides and you need to sort out your priorities so you know what to do, in the least, direct people's attention to the glory of God. So what are these priorities? How do we direct people's attention to the glory of God? What does it look like to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul? Peter tells his readers to submit to every properly established human authority and, of course, to do it for the Lord's sake. 1 Peter 2:13 and 14. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. As Christians, our social and political life is in relation to God. We are foreigners and exiles for the Lord's sake. Christians do not submit to human authority because they feel like it, or because they have compliant personalities, or because the institutions are doing the right thing. We do not look first to ourselves to see what we feel like doing, and nor do we look first at the authority to see if there are consequences for not submitting. We look first to God. Human authorities are set up by God, and their proper function, or at least one of them, is to promote justice. But our submission is not if they are promoting justice. It is submission to them for the Lord's sake. If you disagree with what human authority is doing, and we are a separate chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, and if we are foreigners and exiles, perhaps then we should withdraw into our own Christian communities and have nothing to do with the powers and institutions of the world. Problem is, God considers this submission for his sake good. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Behaviour stamped by courtesy, respect, and integrity is not itself preaching the gospel, but it wins a hearing for the gospel, simultaneously preparing a way for it and authorizing it. You see, we are forgiven by God for all our sins and are no longer under the judgment of God's law. But our freedom from the law must never become an excuse for putting in our own priorities. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. It is always right and good to show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honour the emperor. In this way, Christian submission to the authority of this world becomes a submission to God's authority over the world. You look a policeman or a judge or a politician in the eye and submit to them. Honour them, but not for their sake. Honour for God's sake. Honour because you are bound to God eternally and he rules you. That is our fear of God. God has sovereignly raised up all authority for a limited time and given the leadership that they have. For God's sake and for his glory and because of his rightful authority over all humanity, we honour authority. Our submission to authority shows all that we prioritise God, and for the same reason we show proper respect to everyone and love the family of believers. If any of this involves hardship or suffering, as it especially did in the case of slaves who belonged to cruel, unjust masters, we still submit. 1 Peter 2, 18 to 20. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. 1 Peter 2:16 compared all Christians to slaves. Live as God's slaves. We are slaves of God and not people. Even if we actually are real life slaves to people, and even if this situation we're in is unjust. Don't get bogged down with what slavery looked like then and now. We do not submit to human institutions as slaves to those institutions, but as God's people. We submit in service for His sake, not in servitude for the authority's sake, for the Lord's sake. How much, though, do we allow ourselves to suffer under an unjust authority? We can never forget that we follow a master who himself suffered most unjustly. No moral value attaches to suffering what we deserve. We show ourselves to be followers of Jesus Christ when we suffer unjustly and endure it faithfully. 1 Peter 1:21. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. This is the step-by-step guide to our priorities. What would Jesus do? This is the guiding question for living Christian priorities, but it assumes that we know the Bible well enough to come up with the answers. What were Jesus' priorities? Isaiah 53:9. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Psalm 9:4. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Isaiah 53:4. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. Isaiah 53:5. By his wounds you have been healed. Isaiah 53:6. For you were like sheep going astray. Remember the dingo's priorities were about to be shown? Fire, river, hunter, and croc. What she does next will reveal what is most important. She focuses on giving birth to new life. We are not left hanging with no end to our story as Christians. So let's finish the dingo story. Smoke puts off the hunter's aim and he runs away from the fire. His spear overthrows the dingo and hits the croc, who flees into the river and is washed away. The storm brings rain and the bushfire is put out. The dingo gives birth to a healthy litter of pups. They are all safe. This is also how our story ends. Now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. We are safe despite what this world makes it look and feel like. We expect new life because of God's promises to us. Our eternal souls are safe with the eternal God who we follow and serve. We are more creative, more passionate, more energetic, more accepting of sacrifice to the things we prioritise. Others will see this, and our priorities are also shown to God.